The West and the World, 1815 to 1914. The focus of this lecture is the ideology of imperialism, which originated in modern times during the Crusades from 1096 to 1270, entered its high point or climax in the age of European expansion when the Old World discovered the existence of the New, and entered its final stage between 1815 and 1914. Imperialism between 1815 and 1914 is often called by historians the New Imperialism. Imperialism is a national policy that favors extending power peacefully or forcefully over another nation, territory, or state. The goal of imperialism is the acquisition of colonies, protectorates, or the creation of an empire. Between 1815 and 1914, the West, meaning Europe, gets involved in Africa and Asia. The West desired between 1815 and 1914 to acquire colonies, protectorates, and empire in Africa and Asia. The new imperialism of the 19th century had many causes. These include politics, economics, technology, special interest groups, and nationalism. It was a commonly held political assumption in the period from 1815 to 1914 that in order for a European country to be a major power player in politics, it had to be large, that size equals power. In other words, to be seen as a real power, a European country had to be big, and it had to have overseas colonies in Africa and Asia. Colonies were a must for any European country that desired to be seen as powerful, as a major political power. Economics also played a role in the age of new imperialism. In this time period, European countries are industrialized. Factories dominate the landscape of most European countries at this time. Therefore, European countries are not interested in necessarily going into Africa and Asia to look for gold, which had been their motive in the Americas. Instead, these industrialized countries of Europe are seeking raw materials which can be stripped out of colonies that are conquered in Africa and Asia, transported by steamship back to the mother country, taken to factories, converted into finished goods, and then transported back to the colony as a marketplace. So what European powers are looking for in this time period in Africa and Asia are raw materials for their factories and marketplaces for the finished goods from their factories. In actuality, the economic motive is only partially successful in this period. European powers conquered various territories in Africa and Asia and stripped them of raw materials, which were then transported back to European factories. But colonies in Africa and Asia were too poor to buy the finished goods. Therefore, Africa and Asia could not provide the markets that European powers had hoped. Technology also played a role in the new imperialism. In this period, Europe invents a rapid-fire automatic weapon called the Maxim machine gun, which meant that their conquest of Africa and Asia went much quicker because those areas, Africa and Asia, were not technologically on the same level as European militaries which invaded Africa and Asia. Therefore, this advanced military technology allowed European countries to more quickly add colonies in Africa and Asia as those areas could not compete. Another technological invention in this period which aided the age of new imperialism was the telegraph, which allowed for immediate, instantaneous communication between a mother country in Europe and its colonies in Africa or Asia. Therefore, supplies and reinforcements could be sent much quicker than they had been before. In other words, a European country does not have to wait on a ship coming from a colony in Africa and Asia for news. Instantaneous, effective communication is available with the invention of the telegraph. Another invention in this time period allowed for an easier conquest of Africa and Asia by Europe, and that was the invention of quinine. Quinine was a very bitter-tasting medicine that was a cure for malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne illness that is rampant in tropical, wet, jungle-type terrain like equatorial Africa and many parts of Asia. So quinine allowed European soldiers to invade Africa and Asia without fear of illness. Steamships were also a technological advance that aided this period of imperialism. In the course of this term, in this class, Western Civilization II, we've seen Europe go from, at the beginning of the age of European expansion, from galleys which were man-powered to caravels which were wind-powered, now to ships which are powered by steam engines. These steamships were much faster, much more effective means of transport for raw materials, soldiers, and supplies from a mother country to its colonies. The next cause of new imperialism were so-called special interest groups. These were groups with a special interest or desire in conquest by Europe and Africa and Asia. These included missionaries, shipping companies, and a group called social Darwinists. Missionaries, of course, are driven by the so-called God motive. Missionaries encouraged European countries to conquer territories in Africa and Asia so that these missionaries could go along with soldiers and convert Africans and Asians to Christianity. Shipping companies encouraged imperialism because they were benefiting economically from the conquests in Africa and Asia. Since the primary means of transport from Europe to its colonies in Africa and Asia were steamships, shipping companies benefited. In other words, they're building the ships that are being used by Europe to send soldiers, raw materials, supplies, finished goods, and reinforcements between the mother country and the colonies. So shipping companies encouraged imperialism because as long as there was a need for steamships, these shipping companies would turn a profit. The next group with a special interest in imperialism were so-called social Darwinists. Social Darwinists took the ideas of Charles Darwin and applied them not to animal species, but to races of people and nations. According to social Darwinists like Rudyard Kipling, who is usually more famous as an author of children's stories like The Jungle Book, social Darwinism meant the application of Charles Darwin's theories of survival of the fittest and natural selection, but applied to races and nations of people. In other words, social Darwinists like Rudyard Kipling believed that there were some nations and some races of people that were destined to survive, to be the fittest, and to dominate. Likewise, there were those that were weak and destined to be dominated. Now, this is a Eurocentric and racist idea. So, according to social Darwinists, Europeans were those that were destined to survive, to be the fittest, and to dominate, whereas Africans and Asians were those that were destined to be dominated. So social Darwinists believed that it was quote-unquote the white man's burden, and that is the title of Rudyard Kipling's famous poem about social Darwinism. They believed that the white man's burden was to quote-unquote civilize Africa and Asia. So social Darwinists encouraged imperialism because they believed it was the responsibility of white Europeans to bring quote-unquote civilization to Africa and Asia. The last cause of new imperialism in the 19th century is nationalism. Nationalism, you may remember, is the belief that each nation has an identity and a mission and is superior to other nations. Therefore, nationalism taken to the extreme can result in imperialism, the idea that because we are superior to them, they must be conquered. So nationalism and imperialism were tied together in the period from 1815 to 1914. To be seen as a major political power, a nation had to be big. It had to be involved in imperialism. Nationalism, of course, stressed that we are superior to them, so why not conquer them? So nationalism provided an opportunity for nations in Europe to see themselves as superior to others and to conquer other areas in Africa and Asia so that they could focus on success. Now let me see if I can put this in another way. In most of these European countries at the time, there were major domestic problems such as religious and racial strife, but nationalism and imperialism offered a wonderful distraction. What was often the focus of newspaper stories and government propaganda was not the domestic problems within the nation, but a focus on, look at how great we're doing in conquering territory in Africa and Asia. So nationalism and imperialism provided a distraction. Rather than focusing on domestic issues and problems at home, people were encouraged to look at how great the nation was doing in conquest overseas in Africa and Asia, which would make the country seen as a major political power and figure in European politics. The results of the age of new imperialism included the conquest of the so-called Dark Continent of Africa. In the 19th century, Europeans referred to Africa as the Dark Continent because it was a land of mystery and intrigue. Very little was known about the continent of Africa in the 19th century. The first European country to get involved in Africa was France, and in 1830 France conquered an area in Africa known as Algeria. Other countries then became interested in conquering territory in Africa, but the so-called scramble for Africa, or the desire for African territory, really heated up between 1880 and 1900. In that 20-year period, the nations of Europe began to fight each other and native African people for control over the continent of Africa. So in a 20-year period from 1880 to 1900, the so-called scramble for Africa began. European nations became obsessed with conquest in Africa. The scramble for Africa lasted into the 20th century with the Boer War, which is also sometimes called the South African War. This war was fought between Great Britain and the so-called Dutch Afrikaners from 1899 to 1902. During the period of 1880 to about 1900, the Dutch had already conquered South Africa, and they called themselves, the Dutch people who lived in South Africa, called themselves the Dutch Afrikaners. That area was already under the control of the Dutch. The British, however, desperately desired South Africa, just basically for its land, just for the glory of the conquest, but also because there were very wealthy gold mines found in South Africa. So between 1899 and 1902, The Dutch fought to hold on to their territory. The British fought to take it away. In 1902, the war ended with a British victory, but it was a victory with a cost. While the British could officially claim that they controlled South Africa, in other words, they owned the land of South Africa, they were not in control of the government of South Africa. The British were a minority there. They were slightly outnumbered by the Dutch, and so the British, as a sort of compromise at the end of this war, more or less worked out with the Dutch that the British would own the land, but the Dutch could control the government there. Now, this, of course, meant that a small minority of Dutch were in control of British soldiers who were living there, of British settlers who moved there, and of course the overwhelming population of the people who lived there were the native South Africans. But the Dutch remained in control of that government of South Africa, even though the British claimed the land. By 1900, the so-called partitioning of Africa was complete. Africa had been divided into various zones or spheres of influence. Another way to put that is by 1900, Africa had been divided up among major European powers. There were 7 European countries that were the leading imperialists in Africa. These included Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, and Spain. So by 1900, Africa was carved up. The British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Portuguese, the Belgians, the Spanish all claimed various parts of Africa as colonies and protectorates. But the 2 European countries with the most territory in Africa in 1900 were Great Britain and France. They had huge chunks of African territory that they could claim as colonies. There were only 2 areas in Africa that were able to maintain their independence and stay free from European imperialism. Those 2 were Ethiopia and Liberia. Ethiopia was able to successfully drive out repeated invasions by the Italians because of great leadership under a man named Muhammad Ali, not the famous boxer, but an Ethiopian ruler. Liberia also managed to stay free from European conquest in this period because it was backed by U.S. abolitionists. Liberia means liberty or freedom, and this was a homeland created by abolitionists, those opposed to slavery in the United States, for runaway freed slaves of African descent from the United States who desired to return to Africa. So by the turn of the 20th century, Africa was carved up by 7 major European imperialist powers. Only 2 areas remained free and independent. Those were Ethiopia and Liberia. The age of new imperialism resulted in the conquest of various parts of Asia by 4 European countries. These were Great Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. Great Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands were the leading imperialists in Asia from Europe. The 2 European countries which held the most territory in Asia by 1914 were Great Britain and Russia. So, based on what we've said previously in this lecture, it was Great Britain who was the leading imperialistic power from Europe in Africa and in Asia. By 1848, India had become, as the British called it, their crown jewel in their empire. By 1848, a British white elite numbering about 3,500 controlled the huge subcontinent of India, which had about 350 million native inhabitants. So when we hear those numbers, 3,500 white elite from Great Britain in control of 350 million native Indian people, we may wonder, how is that possible? That just 3,500 British elite could control such a huge native population in such a huge area as India. Well, it has to do partly with superior technology like the machine gun, etc., but we can pretty much do the math here and see that even with machine guns, 350 million people could do something about 3,500 British people with machine guns if they wanted to. So why is it that India remained under British control when the population of India outnumbered significantly, overwhelmingly, astonishingly, the small group that controlled it? Well, it's because India was a bit complicated. India had a major problem, and that was religious division. Now, let me just go ahead and say that these 350 million native Indian people who were under British control were in agreement that they did not want to be a part of the British Empire, but religious divisions prevented them from working together. So while the Indian people wanted the British out, they were not willing to work together for that. The Indian people from 1848 until about 1947 were treated as second-class citizens in their own country. They were used as servants and workers by this British elite. The first attempt by the Indian people to remove the British occupation was the Hindu-Indian National Congress of 1885. This was a group that was formed in opposition to British control. But the problem, as I alluded to a moment ago, were religious divisions within India. While people wanted to participate in the Hindu-Indian National Congress, they didn't know whether or not they could do this morally. Here's what I mean. The overwhelming number of people living in India were Hindus, but there was a small group of people living in northwestern India called Muslims, and Muslims refused to work with the Hindus because Hindus were polytheistic, and Muslims, of course, are monotheists. They worship Allah. So Muslims felt that by working with the Hindus, they would taint themselves somehow and incur the wrath of Allah. Therefore, they did not want to work with the Hindus. Okay, but there's still enough Hindus to come together to drive the British out, is probably what you're thinking, and that's true. But the Hindus also have a problem. The Hindu religion is extremely complicated. It is a polytheistic religion with hundreds and hundreds of gods with different roles and responsibilities, but the major impairment to unification among Hindus was that Hinduism also comes with a caste system or class system. Hindus are divided into 4 categories or castes based on how many times it's believed their family has been reincarnated. Hindus believe in reincarnation, that depending on what kind of life you live will determine what you will come back as in your next life. So if you've been a bad person, you may come back as a bug or something. If you're really good and you live the perfect sort of life, eventually you'll achieve a state of reincarnation called nirvana, where you are totally free of the confines and ailments of a physical body and you exist only in spirit form. So Hindus were divided into 4 castes based on how many times that particular family was perceived to have been reincarnated or reborn. The bottom caste were called the untouchables, and they were considered to be new souls, so to speak. Now, the caste system among the Hindu religion determines who a person can morally and legally marry, be friends with, and what occupation he or she will have. Therefore, the caste system divided the Hindus. The Hindus were not allowed, because of their division into castes, to associate with others outside of their caste. Therefore, this was a complicated situation. Muslims did not want to work with Hindus. Hindus could not work together because of their caste system. So it was going to take something or someone very influential to drive the British out. That someone was Mohandas Gandhi, also called Mahatma Gandhi, born in 1869, assassinated in 1948. Gandhi was a British-educated Indian. As was sometimes the case, the white elite in control of India allowed some native Indian people who showed promise and potential to leave India, be educated back in Great Britain, and to return to India and work in the British-dominated and controlled government of that country of India. Mohandas Gandhi was one of those rare and privileged Indians. He had been given a British education at British expense in Great Britain. He graduated law school and planned to use his training in British law against the British. So when Gandhi returned home, he joined with the Hindu Indian National Congress and changed its focus and preached a message of unity, telling the Muslims and the various Hindu castes that they had to see past their differences to come together for the good and whole of India. Mahatma Gandhi, or the Great Soul is what Mahatma means, used a very effective form of resistance against the British elite. It was called nonviolent non-cooperation, and these methods were actually copied and used by many of the civil rights activists in the United States in the 50s and 60s. Nonviolent non-cooperation was successfully used by Gandhi. He staged sit-ins, marches, fasts, even almost starved himself to death on a number of occasions to get awareness for and public attention for the plight of the Indian people. In other words, what he achieved was to get a lot of bad press as international crews came into India from other European countries and even from the United States. He was successful in capturing a lot of bad press for the British-dominated government of India. What the world saw were horrible images of peaceful Indian people sitting in restaurants where they were not allowed, of marching and demanding voting rights and equal rights in a country that was theirs, in which they were the majority. And when Gandhi began to fast and starve himself to death, pressure on the British government mounted. Other European countries and the United States pleaded with the British to do the right thing, to grant Gandhi's wishes, to give equal rights, civil rights to the Indian people, to consider withdrawal from India. And because the pressure became so much, the British did agree in 1947, thanks to Gandhi's nonviolent non-cooperation, pull out of India and give that country its independence. So in 1947, India was granted its independence by the British. But at that time, the Muslims who lived in India feared that they would just be exchanging British domination for Hindu domination. So they pleaded with the British, as the British were leaving, to create for the Muslims in India their own country. In other words, to give Indian Muslims the right to self-determination. The British agreed to do this, and the northwestern corner of India was sliced away and created as a new country called Pakistan, for Indian Muslims. So in 1947, India became independent of British rule, and Pakistan was created as a homeland for Indian Muslims. Pakistan and India had a very turbulent relationship beginning in 1947 that has lasted into contemporary times. Pakistan feels that it has the right to exist as a free, independent country. Many Indians believe that Pakistan should be a part of India. This is an argument that persists into current times. One of the most tragic pieces of information, I think, about this period is that for all of his work, Gandhi did not get to live and enjoy the fruits of his labor. He was assassinated in 1948 by one of his own people. Most people think when they hear that Gandhi was assassinated that he was killed by one of these British people in occupation of India, but it was in fact one of his own people who had said that Gandhi was too liberal, that by allowing the untouchables, the bottom caste, to participate in the Hindu Indian National Congress, to participate in sit-ins, marches, and fasting, that he had shamed Hinduism, that he had shamed himself. So this Indian assassinated Gandhi for his liberalism. We turn our attention next to the so-called opening of the East. There was a desire among many European countries and the United States to see the so-called opening of two Eastern or Asian countries, Japan and China, to trade with the West. It is the United States that successfully opens, quote-unquote, Japan to trade with the West. This was achieved by the naval Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry was sent by the United States Navy to Japan to negotiate a treaty between the United States and Japan. What the United States hoped to achieve in this treaty was trade relations being established with Japan and the ability of the United States commercial ships and naval ships to dock in naturally occurring harbors in Japan. Our ships were busy trading in Asia at this time, and we desired some sort of place where we could stop that was friendly and rest up, make repairs, and then head back to the United States across the Pacific Ocean. What we have to remember is that in 1853, Japan was nothing like it is today. Japan was, quote-unquote, very backwards, meaning it was nothing like other parts of Asia or Europe or the United States of America. It's almost like Japan was stuck at around about the year 1500. They had a feudal society. They had no industry, no factories, no real technology. The people in Japan were all farmers. The Japanese military, quote-unquote, was made up of soldiers called samurai. That's just another way of saying knights. Their emperor was called shogun. They had a very feudal agrarian society. No industry, no technology. So in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry comes into Japan in one of the U.S. ships, it's a steam engine, big, huge, ironclad ship. It's very intimidating to the Japanese who've never seen anything like this. They called these ships that were brought by Matthew Perry dragons. It was the only thing they could think of that would even come close to what they were seeing. They had never seen a level of technology like this. What Matthew Perry was supposed to do was negotiate with the shogun. Instead, what he used was so-called gunboat diplomacy. Now, luckily this worked out for him. If he had not been successful using this gunboat diplomacy, he could have been court-martialed and thrown in prison. But because he was successful, even though he ignored orders, even though he was ignoring orders, he was successful. And because he was successful, the U.S. government did not court-martial him. What he did was he used the superior technology and power of the U.S. Navy to force Japan to give him whatever he asked for. This is called gunboat diplomacy. I'm working with you sort of, but I'm intimidating you by all the superior technology that I have. So what Commodore Matthew Perry successfully did was open Japan to trade with the United States, and we were given in a treaty the ability to use all of Japan's harbors for naval ships and commercial vessels traveling through and trading in Asia. Now, this opening of Japan to trade with the United States had both good and bad consequences for Japan. Many Japanese people were horrified by the changes that this opening to the West brought with it. Many Japanese people wanted to remain isolationist, have no contact with the outside world at all, and they revolted against the shogun and actually were able to remove him from the throne. But then, in what is called the Meiji Restoration, the emperor was placed back on the throne with popular support, and these people who had been anti-emperor or anti-shogun because of his giving in to the demands of the United States came together to think about a solution to this newly created problem. The idea among the Japanese was, if we are going to resist further intrusion by the West, we have to become like the West. So in what is called the Meiji Restoration, the emperor was allowed to retain his throne, but he became a constitutional monarch, and he set out quickly to rapidly westernize his country. He sent many of his people back with Matthew Perry. These Japanese traveled around the United States looking at, observing, learning about our industries. They then went to Europe and looked at the French government and French society, which was coming out of, at this point, the French Revolution, and had, of course, gone on to establish a constitutional monarchy and republic there at various times. So they were looking at the French government as an example. They then went to Germany and looked at the military of Germany. And when these Japanese people returned home, they told the emperor all of what they saw, and very quickly, in just about a decade, Japan was radically transformed. They modeled their society after French society, taking many aspects of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and putting it into a newly created Japanese constitution, making their country a constitutional monarchy. They copied the factory system of the United States and rapidly industrialized, and they copied the German military example. And within a decade after 1853, Japan was completely unrecognizable. It went from an isolated, backwards, agrarian, rural, feudal country to one that was industrialized with a constitutional monarchy and a fantastic military. At this point, the Japanese began to get a little taste and desire for imperialism themselves. They had been opened as a result of imperialism to trade with the West. Now they felt maybe the time was right for them to get involved in imperialism. So they declared war on China from 1894 to 1895 in what is called the Sino-Japanese War, for an area that was in between both China and Japan called Korea. And in 1895, Japan, which had been a nobody just a few years before, conquered China in war and took as its first colony Korea. Then about a decade later, the Japanese get involved in an area of China called Chinese Manchuria, and it just so happened that the Russians were also involved in that area and desired it as a colony themselves. This led to a war between Japan and Russia called the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia and claimed Chinese Manchuria as its second colony. So Japan goes from nothing in 1853 to the most powerful country in Asia by 1905. And of course we know that Japan plays a major role in World War I, but especially in World War II. The next area that we're going to look at is China. China, much like Japan, was self-sufficient and isolationist. China did not need trade with any other Asian country or any other European country. China was self-sufficient. Everything that the Chinese people wanted or needed was available in China. Therefore, the Chinese had practiced a policy of isolationism, isolating themselves from contact with the outside world. They had no desire to have a trading relationship with any European or Asian country. They were doing their own thing and were quite satisfied with that. But what forced the opening of China were two widely desired commodities, tea and opium. The British had an almost, I guess we could say, obsession with tea, and tea, of course, is still very important to the British today. The best tea came from China, and the Chinese had given some tea to the British, and the British had acquired a taste for it and had decided that it was the best and wanted Chinese tea. But because the Chinese were self-sufficient and isolationist, they saw no need to continue to give tea to British merchants. They had no desire to trade with them, almost wished they had never started giving tea to the British. But the British were determined that they were going to have tea from China. So these British tea merchants worked with the Chinese government and came up with a solution. The Chinese would give tea to the British in exchange for cloth that was coming from India. India made fabulous linen and cotton in this time period, and since that was one of the British colonies, the British took linen and cotton from India and gave it to China in exchange for tea. Well, after a while, the Chinese no longer desired Indian cloth, whether it was cotton or linen. They didn't want it anymore, so they stopped supplying tea to British merchants. British merchants demanded tea. The Chinese government refused to give it. Well, in their time in China, the British had observed that many of the individuals involved in the processing of tea and in the production of tea and exchange of tea were opium addicts. And it just so happened that the finest opium came from northwestern India in what today would be Pakistan. And that, of course, was under British control. So the British began to smuggle into Chinese tea merchants opium in exchange for tea. Unknown, of course, to the Chinese government. So the Chinese tea merchants would give tea in exchange for opium from northwestern India. This worked until opium addiction became a huge problem in China. The Chinese government investigated, found out that the British were involved in smuggling opium into China to acquire tea, and the Chinese government demanded that the British stop the illegal importation of opium into their country. When the British refused, China declared war on the British. From 1839 to 1842, China and Great Britain fought a series of wars called the Opium Wars. The reason for the Opium Wars: tea and opium. The British desired Chinese tea. The Chinese government wanted to stop smuggling of opium into their country. Because China had been so isolationist, it did not realize how far behind it had fallen militarily and technologically. So, in battle, the Chinese used sailboats against British ironclad steamships. The Opium Wars then, of course, went very badly for the Chinese. The Chinese were repeatedly defeated by the British, who were superior technologically and militarily to the Chinese. In 1842, the Opium Wars came to an end. The British were victorious. They forced onto the Chinese what was called the Treaty of Nanking, 1842, and they demanded that China, 1, open itself to trade with Europe and the United States of America, and that tea freely flow out of China into the markets of Europe, and that one city in China called Hong Kong be given over as a British territory. So the Chinese agreed, and in 1842, the British gained control over the port city of Hong Kong. Hong Kong remained a British territory until 1997. We oftentimes have a tendency to think that imperialism ended a long time ago, but in fact it did not. The British owned a colony inside China until 1997. The Opium Wars resulted in massive problems within China. China was divided right after its defeat by the British into two groups. There were some Chinese called Westernizers and others called traditionalists or Boxers. The Westernizers thought that the Opium Wars were the best thing that had happened to China because it showed China how backwards and inferior, quote unquote, it was in comparison to Europe and the West, and that China should become more like Europe, that it should have a constitutional form of government, that it should build factories, that it should become Christian. Traditionalists, on the other hand, thought that China was just fine and should return to its old ways, the ways that had existed before the whole trading of tea with the British had begun. So the traditionalists desired to return China to its pre-Opium War conditions, whereas the Westernizers wanted to push China more towards a European way of life and a European governmental system and the introduction of factories. These two groups fought each other and massacred each other in the period immediately following the Opium Wars, but the tensions between these two groups really reached a breaking point between 1900 and 1903 in what was called the Boxer Rebellion. The traditionalists sought out and killed Westernizers and any Europeans or Americans who were trading or residing in China. The ultimate result of the Boxer Rebellion, and we can say of the Opium Wars, is that the Chinese government could not deal with all these problems. The Manchu dynasty, which had ruled China for generations, collapsed in 1912 under the strain and pressure over how China would develop in its future. China, from about 1912 to 1942, was in complete and total chaos, a constant state of rebellion and civil war. It was not until 1942 until a level of stability and security was established in that country. And in 1942, China decided that its future would be a communist one, and so in 1942 China became a communist dictatorship and is still such to this day, though we might remember from a previous lecture that in communist theory there is no government, so it might actually be more accurate to say that China is socialist. As previously mentioned, the United States was responsible for opening Japan to trade with the United States and other European countries. But the United States did also, surprisingly, conquer some territory in the age of new imperialism. So what area in Asia did the United States control? Well, in Asia, the United States gained control over the Philippines. This was by defeating the Spanish in the so-called Spanish-American War in 1898. As a result of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States gained colonies owned by Spain. These included islands in the Caribbean Sea called Cuba and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is still owned by the United States as a territory. Cuba was given its freedom in 1898. Guam is an island in the Pacific which we still own to this day as a territory. The Philippines, of course, are in Asia near Japan, and we gained those by defeating Spain in 1898, and we held on to the Philippines until World War II. In World War II, we lost the Philippines to Japan. Japan conquered the Philippines, took it away from the United States of America. We regained the Philippines and then decided to give them their independence in 1946. So, by defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War, the United States gained the Philippines, which we lost to the Japanese, regained, and then gave independence in 1946. We gained Cuba, which we immediately gave independence. We also gained Guam and Puerto Rico, which we still hold as territories today. The result of imperialism then on Africa was that that continent was divided into colonies among the major European powers. Only two areas, Ethiopia and Liberia, remained free. In Asia, India became a part of the British Empire. Japan radically transformed itself after being forced to trade with and open itself to the United States. China was transformed into a communist dictatorship as a result of imperialism. And the overall impact of imperialism on international relations prior to 1914 was that the nations of Europe began to regard each other as competitors and rivals for territory in Africa and Asia. Imperialism created a very tense diplomatic scene in Europe by 1914. So, when war broke out in the summer of 1914, all European countries felt they had a score to settle with countries that had beaten them perhaps in Africa and Asia. So imperialism did impact the outbreak and coming of World War I, or the Great War, as the nations of Europe were already hostile to each other from competing against each other in Africa and Asia.